Alright, so let's start this video off real quick, letting all you guys know we're just fine over here. I live in Tennessee, in eastern Tennessee, so I've had a lot of friends and viewers and stuff reaching out to make sure we're okay, and we are. I feel really bad for what happened to the people over there where the tornadoes were, but just to let you know, this is what we got from that storm, was just some heavy rain. It's raining. Alright, so a lot of you have lowered your S10s, just like I have, and I actually ran into a few problems. So if you had your truck maybe go down a little farther than you expected after you installed a set of drops coil springs, or let's say you use some cheap spindles and you've got a clunk in the front end you can't figure out, you're going to want to stay tuned to watch this episode, because I've discovered a couple of problems with some of the white box generic products that's out there. I will also explain to you what white box product is. And then, sorry, there's a bug crawling across the floor. Hi, how you guys doing? Just trying to get intimate while I smash a bug. So anyway, alright, I've been promising it for a long time, but today we're actually going to talk about the front suspension on this Chevy S10. Alright, so last time we left off, I had just cut the front coils on the S10 in order to lower it, and we ended up lowering the thing so far that the lower control arms are basically sitting against the frame. I believe we ended up with about a 5.5 or 6 inch drop when we cut the coils. Part of the reason we had such a low drop is because I made a mistake when I was dropping the truck. When I was cutting the coils, I didn't mention it in the episode because I didn't realize it at the time, but what I had done was I didn't have the spring seated properly on the spring perch up inside the frame. So when I dropped it back down after my first cut, it was sitting a lot higher than I expected, so I went and took a whole nother cut at it, which was too much. So the truck was really low, banging against the frame. It was basically undrivable. Now, could I have lived with it? Yeah, I lived with it for the night to get out to the cruise night, and it looked really good and low, but I had to drive real careful and all that because the cross member was super close to the ground. But the problem with driving a vehicle around like that for any length of time is it's shaking and vibrating and banging around, and even if you don't mind wearing a kidney belt when you drive it, the thing's trying to shake all the bolts and nuts loose on the truck the whole time, and you end up with a problem like this. You end up with a situation where, like, oh, I don't know, the window just decided to just fall out. So the problem with the window ended up just being the little retaining clip. Chevy has a weird way of keeping the windows in the guides, but it's a pretty cool system because it means there's a lot less weight involved in the mechanism and a lot less moving parts. So we fixed that by replacing those little clips. You know, these guys. And got our window going again. But we had to do something about that suspension. It was too low, banging around too much. It looked fine. I liked the way it looked with the front super low, but you got to be able to drive the stupid thing and hit a bump or two once in a while without jarring your teeth loose. So what I did was I went ahead and I bought the cheapest coil springs I can find. And the reason I did that was because my whole goal for this series when I was filming it was to film it in steps in order to cover all the different ways someone might try to lower their truck. So I started off with cutting the coils because that was the cheap and easy way to do it, right? But of course that's not a long-term solution. So the next step was, alright, well, let's buy some lowering springs. But I also liked how low the truck sat. I liked the way it looked that low. So I went ahead and bought the cheapest spindles I can find as well. So what we ended up with was some springs from eBay that were about $40 less than brand name springs. And I ended up with a set of spindles from Speedway, which is a retailer, online retailer. And those were, at the time, about $40 less than the name brand spindles. Alright, so immediately we had a couple of problems when we installed these things. The first problem was it dropped the truck right back down as low as it was before, when it should have brought it up about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. We had about a 6-inch drop from cutting the coils, and after I installed the new springs, we were still at a 6-inch drop. And I was like, well, that doesn't add up. We have a 2-inch spindle and a 3-inch coil. That should be a 5-inch drop. But it dropped to 6. So immediately I thought, there's a problem with the spring rate on these coils, or problem with the installed length, or something like that. And they're cheap white box coils, so that's what to expect. Now, before we go too much farther, I want to explain what white box is. Now, I'm going to do a whole episode on white box and private label product, because I think you guys should be armed with that information when you're buying parts for your vehicles. One of the goals of this channel is to empower you guys to make better decisions, waste less money, and have more success in your builds. So, real quick, just a quick once-over just for the purposes of this video. This is basically a white box product, and that's why it's called a white box product, because It usually comes in a white box with just a sticker on the end of it. Now the difference between this and a manufactured product or a name brand product, even though Jegs is a name brand, some manufacturers either make their own product or they supervise their own manufacturing process, even if it's coming from a factory overseas. They will send representatives, they'll spot check these things once in a while to make sure they fit like they're supposed to and meet the specs they've set forth. They'll be involved in the R&D process and the development of making this stuff. The difference between that and a white box product like this is that if you were to buy, this is a fuel pump, let's call it the equivalent of a Holley Black pump. If you were to buy this from Summit Racing, O'Reilly Auto Parts, Speedway Engineering, Jegs, doesn't matter where you buy it, it's going to be the same pump coming out of the same factories. And the reason is this: these white box products, the manufacturer, in this case Jegs, has nothing to do with the research and development. They don't supervise the manufacturing of the product, and they don't test these on vehicles in most cases. What this is, there's a manufacturer somewhere, a factory somewhere, that's making these things. And what they do is they just make them with no names or anything on them. They stick them in a generic white box, and they ship them to whoever buys them in just a plain white box with nothing on them except maybe a part number. And then Jegs, Summit, O'Reilly's, AutoZone, whoever it is, will get this product in the warehouse, and they will put a sticker on the end of it with their name on it. Now this is something I could do as ClintsStreetMachines. I could just go to this manufacturer, say, hey, I'm going to write you a check. I want 100 fuel pumps. When I order them, they're going to show up in a plain white box like this. There's probably a part number under the sticker. And then what I would do is I would just make my own stickers, put it on the end of the box, and say, hey, buy a ClintsStreetMachines fuel pump. I'm not making it. I'm not doing any research and development. I'm not even product testing. I'm just buying it and reselling it. So that's what a white box product is. So all that stuff you buy on eBay with no brand name that you've ever heard of on it, things like that, any product that shows up in a white box with a sticker on it like this, that's the kind of product we're talking about. So anyway, the springs I bought were white box springs. So I thought, well, they lowered the truck too far. My guess is that they're selling them out of application, which means they sold them to me for a V6 truck, but a 4-cylinder engine probably weighs less. So these springs are actually made for a 4-cylinder. So they let the truck come down too far because of the extra weight. The other thing about that is when I test drove it, once we put these new springs in, the springs weren't controlling the wheel motion very well. Like the springs weren't stiff enough to properly control the wheels when going over bumps and things like that. The weight of the vehicle was too much for the springs. Now, besides the springs being too low, the other problem we had was with yet another white box product, which is the Speedway spindles that we ordered. Now, I was able to, what I did was I ordered up a set of Belltech spindles to replace them with once I figured out what was wrong with them. So here's some footage where I've got them both on the bench once I've removed the Speedway spindles from the truck, where I can show you the issues we were having with those spindles. Okay, so I'm not going to bring the stock spindle back in here because it's freaking filthy and I don't want to clean my bench again. And I can illustrate the point because I've already checked the new spindle, and the new spindle works correctly. So it works just as stock. Alright, so the biggest problem we had with these spindles was that the upper ball joint doesn't fit them. Now, as you can see here, with the ball joint all the way in, there's two problems. For one thing, I've already had this on the truck, so I know for sure this is how it works. This ball joint gets down in there, you put the nut on it, and the nut ends kind of right here, so the cotter pin doesn't even engage the nut properly. So I had to put a washer under it just to get the cotter pin to engage the castle nut correctly. And that's really the only thing that keeps the nuts from backing off. Yeah, so if you don't have a cotter pin going through that castle nut, there's a really good chance that'll loosen up on you. As you can see, that's super loose, which means every time you hit your brakes, it's going to clunk this way. Every time you hit the gas, it's going to clunk this way. When you go into a turn, it's going to clunk over here. And if you're making turns and going back straight, it's going to kind of roll around this thing. Eventually what's going to happen is right here where it's actually touching the spindle, where it actually goes through and makes contact, which is just about 1/8 of an inch area right in here. That's going to snap off at some point if you keep driving on it. So if you've got one of these spindles and it's like this and you're driving around, you're going to hear a clunk. You're probably going to have trouble finding. That's where it is. It's right here. If you have this spindle for the Chevy S10 from Speedway or Western Chassis, that is something you need to look for. Now I say Western Chassis because when I was looking for a replacement for these spindles, since I got it from Speedway, I just wanted to go ahead and stay with Speedway and just exchange them. So I was reading through the Western Chassis page, reviews, I should say, and they described the Western chassis spindles as having a problem with the upper ball joint not fitting correctly, to the point of people were welding them up and remachining them. So you'll notice I dropped this in the Belltech. There's no play in it whatsoever. It's solid as a rock. That's not moving, it's not jiggling, it's not wiggling. So that's the other problem. Now the problem with this spindle, to where this is protruding too far through, so the castle nut goes on too far. Same problem on the steering arm with this one. I haven't checked this yet. I'll check it when I get it on the truck. But I can tell already this is actually thicker than this. There's a pretty good chance, because the taper is probably done correctly on this arm and not this one, hopefully that'll fit right. So in order to put this Speedway spindle on, even with the bad ball joint, if I was to ignore that completely and live with the clunk and not worry about it breaking someday, it still had problem on 2 of the other 3 connections to the vehicle. It's connected to 1 here, the lower ball joint, 2 here at the upper ball joint, 3 here is the steering arm, and 4 would be out here where the wheel bolt's on, where this hub goes onto it. Where the hub goes on, I had to use a spacer for the same reason. The castle nut went on too far to engage the cotter pin. Over here on the steering arm, same thing. The castle nut went on too far to engage the cotter pin, and on the upper ball joint was the same problem, and it rocks back and forth. So the only thing that worked the way it was supposed to on this spindle was the lower ball joint mount. So I hate to say it, I love to give people a good review because I'm a happy, nice guy, but these spindles are garbage. So until they get those ironed out, I would advise against buying. There's differences, right? Like you can see the difference between the Belltech and this one. So these are clearly not made in the same factory. This is a different profile here. You know what I mean? This has a part number on it. This doesn't. This is not a. This is a blind hole. This one's drilled all the way through. I mean, there's just the machine work. Clearly, all the machine work that was done after it was powder coated. I mean, it's really easy to see this is a different manufacturer than this one, just looking at the shape of things. So this cut down here, for instance, is flat and straight, right? On this one, it's curved. Save up the extra. In my case, it was only a $20 difference to step up to Belltech's. Clearly, this is a higher quality spindle. We won't know until we put it on the truck if it fits better. So yeah, I'm dying to see if it fits better. Alright, so installing the Belltech spindles fixed all our spindle issues. The upper ball joint fit like it's supposed to, everything bolted up properly without having to add any spacers or washers or anything like that. Cotter pins all lined up like they're supposed to. It went on like butter. Even the seal on the back of the hub slid nicely and more cleanly onto the spindle. So everything was better. Before we go too far, if you guys are running those spindles or another white box spindle from a different brand that it looks like those, and you're having an issue where maybe you're wearing out tires prematurely, or you're having trouble keeping the car properly aligned, like you keep wondering why your tire wears goofy and they keep fixing it at the alignment shop and then it goes out again in a month, you know, or if you're hearing a clunk when you brake or accelerate or go around turns, go check your upper ball joint, because that is really easy to miss. The only reason I knew that was going on is because I test fit my new ball joints into the spindles while it was sitting up on the bench. If I had just grabbed those spindles and went and thrown them in the truck without dropping the coil springs out and without changing my ball joints, I might not have noticed that, and I might have just bolted it all up and been like, where's this clunk coming from? We'll think of this as a public service announcement, because it's not safe to drive around with that upper ball joint like that. I used Belltech, but there are other brands out there that make quality spindles. That being said, now we're running around on the new spindles, the Belltech 2100s, and we still had those janky eBay springs in there, and the truck was still sitting about an inch too low, so it was banging and rubbing on everything. So here's how we dealt with that. So these are the coils that suck ass. This is what we're going to do. I got these. It's not the cheapest solution. It was 20 bucks a piece for these things. Of course, needed 2 of them, so that's $40, which was about 1/3 of the price of a set of quality coils. I don't know what to say. If you got the money, just go for Belltech, which is kind of where we're getting with this whole series. And not necessarily go with Belltech, but if you're building something, it's not going the way you want because you keep buying the cheaper parts and trying to keep your budget down and everything else. Sometimes your budget gets real expensive, because if I get stuck with these $80 springs, that means that the $120 springs I buy to replace these with are now $200 springs, because I got 80 bucks into these and they're going in the trash bin. So it's not always cheaper to buy the cheapest parts, which was kind of the point of doing this. Let's get back to what we're doing right now, which is talking non-stop, apparently. So these are coil spring spacers from Mr. Gasket. I kind of forgot to tell you what was going on. Now, the deal with these is, let me open one up here. So here's what we're looking at, right? It's just a donut, but it's got a groove on both sides, or on each side, however you want to word that, and it's got a split in it, so you can do this. Alright, and the deal supposedly is, and it feels really hard, this rubber is so hard that it won't squeeze out the sides of this thing under a load. It'll just stop the spring from moving and hold it there. And it does feel like a pretty hard piece of rubber, even though it's flexible in this regard. It does not feel like it's something that's easily compressed. So hopefully this actually works. Now they call this a 1-inch drop, but if you look at it, all it's really doing, and I'll measure it, I'm sure that's an inch right here, right? Looks like maybe 7/8 of an inch or an inch. So anyway, that is supposed to be what the lift is on these things. But the thing is that the lift isn't taking into account total spring length or spring rate. So it's a very approximate guesstimation. So I'm curious to see how much the truck comes up. It may not even come up a full inch. It may come up well over an inch. Because where the spring sits, again, you know, the wheel's mounted further out on the arm that moves around, so a little bit of movement with the spring height is exaggerated at the tire itself. You know, you do a 1/2 inch here, you're going to get more than a 1/2 inch out there. Okay, so I'm curious to see what these do, but first thing we got to do is get them in there. Alright, who's first? Yeah, this looks like it's not going to be easy at all. Like, how do you get it started, you know? Maybe like that. Oh, I see. You can flatten it out. You can open it up. Alright, that's actually proving to be much easier than I expected. Okay. Well, I guess that's pretty easy to install. Alright, so let's go ahead and spin them down here. This will also help kind of hold them in place too. Alright, I like that. That's pretty good. That leaves a lot of spring still to do what it's got to do. Yeah, I like that. So that's how that works. The theory is it keeps that last spring from compressing, so the whole thing sits a little higher. So in order to make sure these things are not moving around when I install this up in the spring pocket, I got these crappy green zip ties I have no intention of ever using, and it seems like the perfect way to kill them. So I'll just stick this in here like so, zip tie that on down, keep the little ear inside. Okay, so that'll keep it from moving around. Well, is it level? How's it look? It is level, and it does seem a little higher off the ground. Oh yeah, that came up quite about the right amount. This might be a tolerable suspension ride height. And even though I don't like that spring setup, it may work for a little while. Holy shit, I have suspension travel. Oh my god! Alright, screw it. I wasn't going to go out here. They're repaving the road out here, and it's got like a 4-inch drop and whatnot. And I wasn't really going to drive on it if I didn't have to. But that's going to be a really good test. So let's see if I get stuck out here. Alright, so we should have like a 4-inch drop off up here. And then there's like an area that's rough where they scraped a pavement off, but they haven't replaced it yet. And then they've repaved on the other side of it, so there's like a 2-inch lip up to that. So let's see how she works. Not really trying to avoid it. Oh, alright. Wow, that actually worked out fine. Alright, last time I drove through these potholes, it killed me, so this one's really evil. Let's see what happens. Whoa, she took it. She took it like a champ. Alright, so it seemed like maybe putting those spring boosters in was going to make the truck drivable and kind of correct the issues we were having with those cheap springs. Problem is, I never got over about 30 miles an hour on that test drive, so I ended up going to a meet later that night, and once I hit about 40 miles an hour, anything I hit on the road, a road reflector or any kind of bump or anything like that, caused complete chaos in the front end of the truck. The spring rate or whatever the problem was with those springs was still allowing the wheels to bounce all over the place like they're completely uncontrolled. Alright, so I needed to get some new springs that were of a higher quality and would control the vehicle properly. Now, while I was in there, I noticed that we were starting to get a leak in one of our shock absorbers. Now, that's normal in this situation because I had used the coil spring to lower the car rather than limiting the amount of drop from the coil spring. So a 3-inch drop out of a coil spring, we probably wouldn't have hurt our shocks. But with the 4-inch drop that we got out of this spring not working properly, and with the 5 to 6-inch drop we got out of cutting our coils, what we did was we shortened the installed length of the shock absorber. So whenever we would hit a bump or that control arm would come up and hit against the frame, it was actually bottoming out the shock, or getting so close to bottoming out the shock it wasn't handling the pressure well. So it started leaking out of the shaft where it goes into the shock absorber. So we needed new shocks. So what I did too is I ordered new shocks at the same time. Now what I ended up going with was Belltech shocks. As you'll see here, we ended up going with Belltech everything. Now the reason for that is the Belltech shocks. So Belltech sells two different shocks. They sell a nitro drop and they sell a street performance. Now when I'm online looking at people's reviews of Belltech shocks and whatnot, a lot of people say they hate Belltech shocks and a lot of people say they love Belltech shocks. But neither one of them seem to say which shock they bought. They just say Belltech shocks. So you need to differentiate between those two. In my case, I went with the Street Performance, and the reason I did that is because I've always used the Street Performance shocks, and I've always been very happy with them. Shock absorbers is one of those things where you don't want to be cheap. No matter what your car is or what you're doing with it, you buy cheap shocks, you're gonna know it. You want quality shock absorbers. They are one of the most important factors of making a suspension ride properly and handle the way it's supposed to. So I would always recommend buying the most expensive shocks you can afford, as long as they're a name brand and they're not just gouging you on the price, but they're actually quality shocks. So here's the thing. I think the guys who hate the Belltech shocks are running the nitro drops, and I say that because I've never used the nitro drops. The nitro drop is the more affordable of the two shock lines that Belltech sells. Now, these shocks are designed to fit with a 3-inch lowered coil spring, so they actually have a shorter length when they bottom out. So they can be smaller before they bottom out, is what I'm trying to say. They're designed for a lowered suspension, so you don't have to worry about blowing them out the way you would a stock length shock. So if you've lowered your truck with a coil spring and you're blowing shocks out and you're wondering why they keep blowing out or thinking the shocks are just cheap, it's probably because you're not buying a shock designed for a shorter installed length. A couple ways you can go about that. You can either buy a brand name like, you know, Gugui, Suspension Techniques, you know, Belltech, DJM, something like that, where they've designed the shock to fit a lowered vehicle. And if you don't want to deal with one of those, say you work at a parts store and you get a good deal on Monroe or Gabriel or something, they do make shock absorber charts that will show you the installed length and the expanded length of all their different shock absorbers. And you can go through those charts and you can figure out a shock that has the same type of mounts top and bottom but has a shorter installed length, or has a travel length that works better for a lowered vehicle. So you can always find a shock, and you can also go on forums and places like that and Facebook groups, and someone will have already done that homework and they'll let you know that, you know, some other vehicle's shock absorber will work perfectly in that situation. Okay, so now we've got Belltech spindles going in, we've got Belltech springs going in, and we've got Belltech shock absorbers going on. So I went ahead and installed the springs at their 3-inch dropped length. Get the truck back on the ground, and it's just as low as it was before, just like the cheap springs. The cheap springs lowered it about 4.5 inches. So did the Belltechs, which it shouldn't have done. The Belltechs should have been dead nuts at close to 3 because they've been selling them forever. They're a quality brand. I've never had a problem with Belltech before. But here's the funny thing I discovered. When I bought those Belltech springs, I looked it up on the Belltech website, and then I went and bought them from Amazon. I always double check the part numbers before I buy anything because I hate having to return parts, and I hate having to sit around and wait for replacements because I ordered the wrong part. So I always double check the manufacturer's part number on their website before I order from someone else. So that's what I did with the Belltechs, and when I looked them up, I punched in my vehicle, which my vehicle has the 4.3 V6. So I punched in my vehicle information, it brought up all the parts available for it, got the shock absorber part numbers, those worked out fine, and I got the spring part numbers. Now the spring shows a 2 or 3 inch drop. What that means is they give you a spacer to bring it up to 2 inches if 3 inches is more than you want. took me a minute to figure that out, so I wanted to let you guys know in case you've seen that and don't know what that means. They don't explain it really well on the website. So anyway, I looked it up, and what I found odd was it didn't call out that they fit a 4-cylinder or a 6-cylinder. It just showed the shock as fitting the S10, but there was no differentiation. And I thought it was really weird, so I went and checked the 4-cylinder application, and it showed the same part number for the 3-inch drop coil. So I'm like, well, they call it an Iron Duke. Maybe the 4-cylinder is really heavy, and the 6-cylinder is somehow a little lighter, so maybe there's not that much of a difference, and it only makes maybe a ½ inch difference in the amount of drop or something like that, so they just sell one spring to cover all. Well, here we are 15 months later after I bought those things. I go on the website today to get the part numbers to give you guys. I go back to my Amazon order, I look up the part number I ordered, I click on it, it goes to the application page, shows that it fits my truck. I go over to the Belltech site, punch in my vehicle information. They don't list a 2 or 3-inch drop spring for my truck anymore. Well, that's weird. I specifically looked it up. So I took the part number from my Amazon order, punched it in the search on the Belltech website, and it came up, but it says now that it only fits a 4-cylinder. So it seems that Belltech has changed the application at some point in the last 15 months, because that's how long it's been since I bought those things. Now, that explains why the vehicle's sitting lower than it should. I ended up with about a 4 to 4.5 inch drop out of my 3-inch drop coils. Now, it was too low. I was still having some banging issues. It was definitely controlling the ride better. There was definitely a lot less diving and stuff going on, and it's definitely sitting lower than it should be. I think we ended up with close to a 5-inch drop using the coil in its 2-inch state, meaning I used the spacer. The Belltech springs came with these spacers right here, and I'm not looking at the viewfinder. I've got to turn the other way, so I apologize if this isn't in frame. I'm trying here something different. Anyway, so basically the deal with these spacers is you put these in the spring and it raises the vehicle 1 inch. So we might try those because they're a lot better quality than trying to use these things. And it brought the truck up that extra inch, about 3/4 of an inch. But as you can see, my truck sits pretty low, and that's supposed to be a 5-inch drop. But every other vehicle I look at with a 5-inch drop, it sits higher than mine. So my truck's supposed to be a 4-inch drop now because I added that spacer. And it definitely sits lower than people who say they have a 4-inch drop. So I think what happened was Belltech must have realized that they didn't work very well on the V6, or they had just mistakenly listed it for the V6 when I happened to buy mine. It could have just been a website error or something like that. Now, on Amazon, it still shows those springs as fitting the V6 truck, so be careful. So what I'd like to know from you guys, if you have one of these trucks and you have a V6 in it, and you bought a 3-inch drop coil, I'd like to know if you had any problems with it dropping more than 3 inches. But in suspension, you do have options. Like I went with Belltech, but there's also companies like Magooey's. There's companies like DJM, Suspension Techniques, Eibach. Those companies all control their own manufacturing processes, whether they're making it themselves or not. So you should get a better quality product out of those brands. So, you know, in short, now that we're at the end of the video, yeah, sometimes it makes more sense to just buy the quality product right off the bat, because even though you're saving a few bucks buying the cheap stuff, you end up running into some problems that you may not have expected. And then if you end up buying the good stuff at the end of it all, like I did, now you're out the money that you spent on the cheap stuff in addition to, you know, buying the good stuff instead of just buying the good stuff right off the bat. But I did that because, like I said, I wanted to do a YouTube series where you guys got to see what happens when you buy the cheap stuff, some of the potential problems you could have. Now, I bought quality product and still ended up with a problem of it being lowered too much. I happen to like the way it looks. I don't have a problem with it sitting that low. Suspension-wise, it works okay. It's just I have some clearance issues with the wheels are hitting the firewall if I have the wheel turned close to locked position. And I have a second person in the vehicle with me, or if I take a corner a little fast at full lock, it'll rub on the firewall, the tire will. I don't really have any other problems other than that. Now, we do have a couple suspension issues that I'm going to deal with in another video. Stay tuned. I'm not sure where we're going with this front suspension. I'm doing some budgeting right now to see if I can afford to do something a little more dramatic to get this truck even lower. So that's probably where I'm heading with it, and if I do that, we may not even need some of these components. So that may all be erased if we end up doing something like an airbag system or something along those lines. So hopefully that gives you some ideas on what might be going on with your own trucks if you're having some issues, and hopefully it gives you some ideas on what to buy if you're about to lower your truck so you don't end up with parts that aren't working for you. So anyway, thanks again. I appreciate you guys watching, and we will catch you in the next one. Take care.